Hello, everyone. Uh, Welcome to this episode of The Federal. My name is Naved Anjum, and I have a very special guest today, Mr. Charles Dunst, the Deputy Director of Research and Analytics at the Asia Group. It's a strategic advisory firm based in Washington, D.C. Mr.
Thanks
Dunst
for
has
having me.
come out. Yeah, Dunst, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Mr. Dunst has come out with a book called Defeating the Dictators: How Democracy Can Prevail in the Age of Strongman. It's a very relevant book, especially at a time when, we have autocracies around the world which are on the rise, and we have demagogues with authoritarian tendencies in several parts of the world. So in the book, he basically argues that democracy remains the superior form of governance, but of course they have to, in order to beat autocracies around the world, they have to make huge investments to win the human capital. He underlines, of course, that it's democracy's investments in people, technology, and climate, most importantly, that will define our shared future in the face of the threat from autocrats. Mr. Dunst, my first question to you would be, you outline in the introduction to the book that it is essentially an aspirational roadmap to ensure that democracies deliver on their promises. It's only then, you argue, that we can usher in a more democratic and peaceful world. If you could briefly outline, that roadmap that you describe in the book.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I can't go through all of them because it would take us 45 minutes, but I basically tried to lay out 8 chapters of 8 principles of good governance or 8 items of good governance that are needed in both democracies and autocracies alike, actually, with the argument that democracies, because we are open systems, because we have open debate, we can do many of these things better. So I started off with this notion of meritocracy, with the argument that people need to, or countries need to staff their governments in a far more merit-based way, rather than people who have connections, who know the prime minister, who know the president in the United States, kind of getting elevated to the top. It'd be much better if we staffed our governments meritocratically, and kind of more broadly, if our systems were more meritocratic. So we were giving more education funding to low-income households to ensure that the kids who have the best test scores when they're 15 or 20 or whatnot are not just the ones coming from wealthier households. So I opened up with merit. I talked about accountability, which is probably more of a problem is in the US and the UK, I would say, maybe, where this notion of governments not being held accountable for either being corrupt at times or being not particularly competent, and that there's not a ton of accountability there. Then I moved on to trust, which I think is actually probably the most important chapter, because it's going to be very hard to get any of these reforms done if people don't trust their government. And that is probably more of a problem in Europe and then in Northeast Asia. So both Japan and South Korea have low levels of trust in government. And that trust is different than in the United States. I think American distrust in government it looks like anger. I mean, people get angry at the government. I don't think there's as much anger in Japan and South Korea, but there is still kind of simmering frustration. But without that public trust in government, you're going to struggle to do just about anything, whether that's an effective pandemic response, whether that's being able to build infrastructure, which is another one of my chapters. So I think trust is kind of the one around which, frankly, much of this revolves. And some of the kind of other ones at the end I talked about were the notion of long-term thinking, that democracies would be really wise to have these 5 or 10-year plans that even if we don't accomplish them, or even if there is a change in government politically, we can still hold ourselves fairly accountable by saying, well, what's our 10-year plan to raise life expectancy? Or what's our 10-year plan to improve our education metrics, our education performance? So that was one. Infrastructure is another one. And I think obviously there are many democracies on kind of the different end of the spectrum here, whereas the United States probably needs to just repair our declining infrastructure and then kind of build future-focused infrastructure, whereas a country like Indonesia might need more of the basics at the moment. But ensuring that we're actually focused not only on fixing infrastructure just when things break and just in times of crisis, but actually all the time, and thinking about, okay, well, what is the infrastructure we need in 40 years going to look like? How can we digitize it? How can we make sure it's functionally on the cloud? That was one other item. And then so was the social safety net, and making sure that we're thinking about revamping the safety net for the 21st century and beyond, because we have so many people who are gig workers who are not covered by the traditional safety net in the United States and in Europe. And the US and Europe have taken very different approaches here. And I'm not sure either one has worked particularly well. So thinking about revamping the safety net was one. And then human capital is obviously a big one, because given the spread of the internet around the world, there are probably more talented people today than there have ever been, where it is really easy for someone in Washington to find someone very talented in a country like India or in a country like Malaysia or in a country like Zimbabwe to get something done really fast. And that was just not the case 30 years ago. The internet has made all of this much easier, and making sure that democracies are actually investing in building that human capital of the future, of the people who can build or design semiconductors, of people who can design and build electrical vehicle technology, whereas it far too often kind of seems that particularly Western democracies are kind of comfortable outsourcing that. And certainly for a variety of reasons, the West is not going to return all manufacturing to our own borders. It's not doable, but making sure that we have the skills at home for some critical items would be really positive, I think. So as you said, it is an aspirational roadmap. I think some of these things are more doable than others in the short term. I think human capital and infrastructure are probably fairly doable, but the merit and accountability might be a little bit trickier in the short term.
Right. It's very interesting how you begin the book. Of course, the introduction, you begin with the story of Singapore. And of course, it's a very staggering story of growth, of the preference of development over liberty. And precisely what is the case in, several countries like China. And, you have the story of Vietnam. And, on the other spectrum, you have, democracies like India and the US, where one of them is the oldest democracy and one of the other is the largest democracy. And, and this whole contradiction in the quality of, and the difference in the quality of life in these countries. So I just wanted to know if a lot of this frustration of people living in these democracies, and when they compare, for instance, in India, I would talk about, has also to do with how, life remains very hard to live in a democracy, even though you have liberty, even if you have the freedom of speech and expression.
I think these democracies are all very different. I mean, in the sense of, I don't think there's that same frustration in a democracy like Japan or in a democracy like Denmark that has a better safety net than the United States does or than India does, perhaps. I think it's not about frustration with democracy. It's more so about frustration with their democracies, and a sense that our democracies are not working as well as they should be. Because you hear it from Americans all the time, where not only do people go to Singapore and come back and say, oh my God, Singaporean infrastructure is amazing, people say the same thing about Denmark. They say the same thing when they go to Denmark and they feel like, oh my God, look how pretty everything is. Look at how healthy everyone is. Look at how the trains connect everything really well and there are no delays. So I don't think it's people necessarily saying, well, it's democracy that's not working. It's that, well, it's our democracies that are not working. And then the question is, well, why is that? What's the institutional problems? What are there cultural problems? What's kind of the issue here? So I think that was what I tried to make clear, was becoming Singapore is not a solution. I don't think it's reasonable to, it's certainly not reasonable for me to say no democratic country should become authoritarian in the name of economic growth. It's not going to work. And I think, as I said repeatedly in the book, it's definitely not worth the trade-off. There's no amount of economic development that could convince me that I'd rather live in an autocracy than a democracy. The social science is actually quite clear that if you live in a democracy, you are more likely to live longer. You are more likely to have a richer social life. Or a richer cultural life. You are more likely to earn more money. And frankly, you are more likely to be an innovator or to be a leading artist, because I joke all the time that I think the United States and India are very similar in that they're very big, very loud democracies with lots of voices, and it can seem like chaos at times. But I think we're better for it because we embrace the chaos and we embrace the tumult. And as a result, we can produce really amazing innovations, really amazing art and all that. And it's not to say that autocracies can't. Certainly China has proven itself fairly able to innovate. But I would argue that in an open democratic system, you are more likely to innovate more. So it's just making sure that we figure out a way to kind of reform our institutions to make sure that people do believe in democracy enough to stand up for it. And that's the point of the book. The point of the book is not to say, well, oh my God, we all need to become like Singapore. It's more so to say, no, we need to look at basically countries everywhere that are doing things well to think about, well, how can we do it even better? And I think I used the Denmark example on the safety net point of, well, Denmark has a really good safety net, but even Denmark's safety net is not 100% updated for the gig worker economy. So that's kind of where I would leave it there, is that certainly there are a few autocracies that have proven themselves able to provide economic growth without liberty. And that is a real challenge to democracy, because in the past, I mean, past competitors, you think of the Soviet Union, never really produced that same level of economic growth. So the system never had the same amount of legitimacy. So it never really posed the same kind of concern that I would say the kind of China, Singapore, Gulf state, even Vietnam, even the challenge they pose of, frankly, they figured out how to get rich without democracy. And that's just it's a new problem. And that's why, for one reason, I don't think the Cold War kind of vision here is particularly apt to the 21st century.
I was also wondering if, what do you think would be the telltale signs of dictatorship? I mean, suddenly if a democracy chooses to, and this marks this transition from democracy to dictatorship, what are those telltale signs? When does a democracy cease to become a functioning democracy? And
The line I draw of when a democracy ceases to become an autocracy is when elections are no longer free and fair in any meaningful way. And that is something I would talk about as having happened in Hungary. And I used to live in Hungary, and I think it's a good example of basically was a reasonably consolidated democracy, had fairly free and fair elections, and Viktor Orban won. I mean, he free and fairly won an election, and basically over the years, with his constitutional majority, or his majority to override the constitution, essentially at times, or to rewrite the constitution, has basically done away with many of the protections of democracy. So he's politicized the judiciary, cracked down severely or on free press, and basically literally every journalistic outlet is owned by a friend of his or his party. He's even extended voting rights to ethnic Hungarians in neighboring countries who are not citizens, but they are ethnically Hungarian. So he extends the vote to them because they are minorities in their own countries. They're more likely to vote for him because he's promising to protect the Hungarian identity, Hungarian ethnicity. So I would say that is probably a very clear example to me of a democracy having slid into autocracy. Whereas I think very often, and probably more in Western media, there's an impetus to kind of look at big, complicated, messy democratic countries and say, well, oh my God, we're so concerned about democracy there, and things are backsliding. And there is a question, of course, between what is a good democratic system and one that is delivering versus one that at least meets the minimal definition for being a democracy. And I remember around the Philippines election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., there was a lot of concern of, well, how did he get elected? Was it because he was spreading information on social media? And there was this concern, I think, in Western media of people saying, oh, he's not going to be a Democrat, he's going to do away with the systems. But so far, he's been perfectly democratic. And even if the Philippines system does not work so well on a day-to-day basis, in the sense that I certainly don't think the Philippines safety net is amazing. I mean, I think Philippines, the mortality rate or more life expectancy is not exceptional. But he came to power democratically and seems to be abiding by the institutions. So that's the minimal definition. As long as you come to power by free and fair elections, I think that is a democratic system. One can debate how effective that democratic system is, but that's kind of the baseline. And in terms of warning signs, it's an interesting question because I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of what goes first. What's the first item that goes? And I think it's different in certain countries where sometimes it can be the judiciary. The judiciary gets so politicized first that it stops holding the government accountable. Sometimes it's the free press. It's the muzzling of journalists and saying, well, there's no free press anymore. It gives the government kind of carte blanche to do what they want. So it is keeping an eye out for things like that. And those are probably the most concerning. And it is, the Hungary example is kind of a mix of all of them, honestly, where you basically had a very popular man find his way into power totally democratically and then doing away with the systems from inside. And that is the new type of strongman we're seeing today. That's not really like the past generation of people who mainly, think about the developing world, took power after colonialism, and their legitimacy was around being anti-colonial. And that was how they were able to establish authoritarian regimes. I think about much of Africa, much of the Arab world. And that's not really the case today. The concern is much more so about people coming to power within quasi-democratic systems or fully democratic systems like Hungary, and then basically doing away with democracy internally. And that's a fairly new challenge if you think about since, I guess, the early 1900s, post-World War II, to the mid-1900s. So it is a very much a new challenge.
Right, right. In this context, I think the case of the Middle East, as you mentioned, that how for now, when the oil has made it possible for the regime to give a better lifestyle to its people, but at some point they have to figure out the alternative way because the oil resources are limited, and they have to really decide on a different model maybe. So this dichotomy, if you look at countries in the Middle East are faced with. If you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I was recently in the UAE and I was recently in Oman, and I think about this in the context of those two countries, and they're very different. I mean, Oman is fairly much, smaller in terms of population, not as kind of built up like Abu Dhabi or Dubai is, but they do face the same challenge, as you're saying, of, well, we've basically quelled any demands for democracy by providing a really good life for our people. And I think about it this way: life expectancy in Oman is actually higher than life expectancy in the United States. And that's pretty remarkable for a country that most people in the West don't think about very often, or a country that emerged from colonialism maybe like 50, 60, 65 years ago, a little bit longer than that, 70 years ago. But they do face the same challenge, as do basically all of the Gulf states, of, well, where do we diversify our economy to without oil? And the UAE is probably in a better position, just given how much of their economy is already based around finance and just international business and financial flows. Whereas Saudi Arabia is going to struggle, I think, a little bit, because there is a view in major kind of Western financial hubs of Saudi being a bit regressive at times, and people are very concerned about the US-Saudi relationship as being bad. And as a result, I mean, as of course any company worried about a country, if you're an American company and you're worried about the United States' relationship with a certain country, you're going to be hesitant to put a lot of money in that country. So I think that's going to be a problem for Saudi. Whereas the UAE, the US-UAE relationship is really quite strong. Same thing. I mean, Oman is not a financial hub in that way, but same thing. Same general thing with Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. So it is a question of where do they diversify beyond finance? And I think we've yet to really see what it's going to be. I mean, Saudi and Oman, to some extent, are both basically trying to get their native citizens to work more. It's a problem in Oman where basically if you're a native Omani, they only really want to work upper class jobs. They only want to work office jobs. Whereas, and there's this new-ish policy called Omanization, where the government is trying to motivate Omanis to go work in coffee shops or to go work in restaurants. Whereas right now, the only people in Oman who run restaurants and coffee shops are actually South Asian migrants, mostly folks from Bangladesh, Nepal sometimes. There are a few people from Africa, but not from, I guess, the east coast of Africa, but not so much. So the west coast of Africa. So it is kind of a question of how do you actually convince people to do that? And how do you, and this will be the major, I think, authoritarian challenge for that region, of their political stability is based around providing economic benefits and basically ensuring that people don't have to work so hard. It's very easy, I think, in the UAE to maintain political stability when 10% of your population are natives and you can give them plum jobs, and they can send their kids to Oxford and on holidays to London very easily. But when that's not so easy, it is a kind of an ongoing question of, well, how can you win your legitimacy, your system's legitimacy, when your legitimacy has been so oriented around oriented around the economy, and maybe the economy won't be so good. So I think it's an open question, but it is going to be for things like financial services, things like basically encouraging more consumption, to be more of a consumption-based economy. I'm curious to see if there's any interest in those countries in basically looking towards manufacturing a bit more, particularly around things like electric vehicles and semiconductors that are, as of now, the supply chains are fairly dominated by China and then to a lesser extent the West. And it's kind of an interesting question to me of if the Gulf states basically look to say, well, we want to be the supply chain for this kind of crossroads of the Arab and basically South Asian worlds, because they do kind of sit obviously right between the two. And I'm not sure if they figure that out yet, but I would look for possible semiconductor investment, EV investment, things like that.
Yeah, yeah, right. Something about Mr. Dunst about geopolitics and the world order. I mean, of course, this is a question in which the role of the US is very, very important after the dissolution of the Soviet Russia. And, the US, of course, became the world power. But it's a place that it will also cease to be a true, blue world power in that sense, in the sense that, that Russia can carry on this invasion of Ukraine for nearly a year now. And you cite that China's takeover of Taiwan, of course, and China has a history of human rights violations against the Uyghurs that you mentioned, and how silence of the Islamic world in that context. I was wondering this case of China, that how it's sort of refashioning the whole, the world order in its favor, and its ambition, and how it's going to be its play out in the years to come.
Sure. I mean, I think I'm not the first one to say it, of course, but in terms of China's approach to the international order, I think Chinese leaders look at the liberal or rules-based order that the United States and the West set up after World War II, and I think Chinese leaders think that that order is not giving them adequate power and not giving them adequate respect, because they say, well, by some measures, we're already the world's largest economy. Why are we kind of treated sometimes? Why is the system not oriented around Beijing? Why is the system oriented around Washington? And I think there is a sense in Beijing of, well, the U.S. is declining. Look at January 6th. Look at the Trump election. The U.S. is in decline. We should kind of take over this order. And I think there's this interesting debate, and it's a little bit nerdy and academic, but it's a question over whether or not China is basically seeking to refashion the existing order in its own image and in its own favor, or if China is trying to rewrite a new order. And I'm sympathetic to the first item, because I think no country has benefited more from the rules-based order than China, because it was the rules-based order that allowed for this massive free trade between China and the rest of the world that essentially enabled China to get as rich as it is today. And I think China is basically trying to refashion that system in a more politicized way in Beijing's favor. So I think one example here is you think about China's trade with countries like Australia or countries like Lithuania, where at times, or even South Korea and Japan, where at times China will break those trade ties because Australia calls for an investigation into COVID-19's origins, or because Lithuania is critical of the Chinese government on its certain policies or certain approaches or whatnot. And that, to me, is a bit of an indication of what a kind of Chinese helmed order would look like. I think it would be an order that permitted some type of free-ish trade. Certainly, the world would not become kind of communist in the way that everyone is self-reliant on themselves. As much as China wants to be more reliant on itself for key technology items, I think there still would be massive trade around the world, but there would be much concern in countries like Australia and countries like Germany that are really reliant on trade ties with China. There'd be a lot of fear of basically angering China for fear of losing those ties. And this is something I say at the end of the book, where that Chinese order does not exist in full, but I think it does exist in part, where you can kind of see it with Germany's approach to China as of now. Germany is really hesitant to say anything particularly critical of China. Olaf Scholz, of course, was the first Western leader to visit China since COVID, maybe 5 or 6 months ago, despite the fact that the United States, President Biden is not going to go to China. I don't anticipate anytime soon. And I don't think the UK leaders would either. But it's basically fear of criticizing China because of how economically central China already is. And an order properly centered around China would only augment those concerns. And I think you would see similar concerns bedevil countries that rely on the Gulf states for oil. And certainly you've already seen that, where the U.S. was very critical of Saudi Arabia for the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. And kind of partially as a result, when Biden asked the Saudis to produce more oil, they didn't. And certainly I wouldn't draw a straight line. I don't think it's because one thing happened, the second thing happened, but it certainly played a role. And it is this ongoing issue of, I think there is a little bit of fanciful thinking sometimes that, well, a world of autocracy, of more autocracies, will be a world of Singapores, or a world of Vietnams, of countries that are actually quite friendly, certainly friendly to India, friendly to the United States. I mean, Vietnam is a very close partner. Singapore is a very close partner. But to think that an autocratic world order would kind of mirror those relationships, I think is a bit naive. So it is figuring out how we can be strong enough at home and how we can basically serve as enough of a model abroad to prevent more and more countries from kind of succumbing to the autocratic impulse, and to, as a result, kind of aligning themselves with the Chinas of the world or the Gulf states of the world.
We have a few minutes left, Mr. Dunst. I would like to just conclude with two quick questions about India, questions specific to India. That is, India, of course, is a multi-party democracy, and in the past also there have been instances where it has been written off, mostly by Western scholars, that as an impossibility, perhaps. But India has, in fact, over all these years, managed to defeat those notions and predictions for the best. So, how do you see that in the light of the recent few years in India?
I think, I mean, India is certainly a huge, loud, and kind of confusing democracy. I think for anyone sitting abroad who's not Indian, I think it's very confusing to understand. And honestly, it's funny for me because I think as an American, me trying to understand Indian democracy is often like Europeans trying to understand American democracy, where it's very confusing. It's just there are too many. I mean, of course, India is properly multi-party. I mean, the United States really only has two, but it is the same confusion, I think, of trying to understand the intricacies of local politics in a country that is so big and so diverse and so different from the South to the North or from the East to the West. And it's the same thing in the United States, where I think if you're an observer in maybe Germany trying to understand a local Tennessee election or the California election or a Texas election, you say, how are these elections all in the same country? I mean, they seem to be revolving around much different issues. And I think that is something I think about a lot, because when I read about India, mostly in Western outlets, the coverage is always very national. It's always about, well, what's going on in New Delhi? Who is the prime minister meeting with from abroad? What are the prime minister's new policies? What's his agenda? And as much as that is really interesting, I think it's actually quite helpful to think about more local governance, because that is, I mean, I'm not the first one to say, and it's a little bit cliche, but that is where the real democracy happens, is at the local level of thinking about, well, what are certain cities doing? Some cities that are not New Delhi, smaller cities, what role are they playing in the supply chain? What role are they playing in terms of democratic elections, in terms of, well, is the ruling party winning? Is the opposition winning? What does that say about people's satisfaction with the government? So again, it's this joke that I do think the India and the US are kind of similar on this front. And certainly we both face real challenges when it comes to kind of maintaining our institutions and ensuring that the rule of law continues to basically triumph and be the back end, because as much as politicians in both New Delhi and Washington, we both at times have had really strong leaders who are very focused on certain agendas in terms of economics, in terms of technology, and just ensuring that those strong leaders continue to respect the rule of law will be, I'm not sure a challenge going forward, but will be just something that particularly journalists, of course, the third estate, that you guys have to kind of continue helping us all do.
Yeah. In the case of India, and I'm sure that there are radically left voices in the West, in America as well, who have been cautioning about a possible threat to democratic practices both in India and the US, and especially in the context of India. How do you look at that? Those cautioning of the left voices against this compromise of democratic principles.
Yeah, I mean, I'm concerned in any democratic society when there seems to be a shuddering or a moving against journalists, against opposition speech. And that's one thing I would actually give the United States a lot of credit on, is as much as we have many problems, freedom of speech is not one of them, in that the government does not step in to shut down news outlets. The government does not step in to silence critics. So it is a concern to me when democratic countries do that, because as we've discussed before, it does tend to be the first step towards something worse. So I'm not an India expert, so it's a little hard for me to speak directly to kind of the situation in India. But I would say that I think there are ongoing discussions between certainly the United States and India to basically figure out, well, how do we accomplish all of our what's on all of our agendas while ensuring that we retain our strong democratic character. And I think senior Indian officials are certainly committed to that, even if there are kind of disagreements between New Delhi and Washington on specific policies or on what should democracy look like exactly. I'm not so concerned about a leader in India or a government in India trying to severely overstay its welcome and kind of cement an autocracy. I'm not so concerned about that. I think it's more so just ensuring that as our leaders push forward with really bold plans, particularly in India around manufacturing for semiconductors, around just broadly kind of opening up a bit more to trade with the West or trade with the world. I mean, of course, India has a new FTA with the UAE, just ensuring that we do have this rule of law backstop behind these strong plans and these big agendas.
On that note, thank you so much, Mr. Dunst. It was lovely talking to you. I do hope that autocrats around the world take a leaf out of your book and invest in human capital and the happiness of the human beings in the country. I mean, they're citizens of the country. Thank you so much. It was lovely talking.